We have made it through 11 lessons in this course without ever really talking about cameras, and that was very intentional because the other aspects we talked about, like lighting and setting up your scene and styling your food, actually matter a lot more than the camera and which specific camera you use and how to use it. But finally, we're going to learn about why cameras matter and why they don't matter so much. We'll look at a few technical aspects of your camera, from the ISO and the shutter speed and the aperture, and this will be probably the only place in the course where we get a little bit technical. We'll go over the differences between the iPhone camera, the point-and-shoot camera, and a DSLR camera, and how they differ technically and why you might want to use one as opposed to another. And finally, we'll have a quiz game where I'll show you a series of pictures and you have to decide whether they were taken on an iPhone, a point-and-shoot, or a DSLR camera. And we'll look at some of the differences and highlight how different cameras can take different pictures. Before we can get started talking about cameras, I need to make it very clear that you should never, ever blame the camera for bad shots. I just recently heard a great story. It's the story of a chef and a photographer. So the chef makes this great food, the photographer takes pictures of it, and when the chef sees those pictures, he says, "Wow, those are such great pictures. What kind of camera do you use? I want to get that camera so I can take pictures like that." So the photographer kind of rolls his eyes and tells him what camera he uses. And then a few months later, the photographer is eating in the chef's restaurant, and the chef comes out, and the photographer says to him, "Wow, this food was so amazing. What kind of stove do you have? I want to get that stove so I can cook food like this at home." And that's kind of a dramatic example of how the chef would feel so offended that he thinks the stove made the food great and not the skill of the artist and the chef. And the photographer would feel the same way. It's not so much about what camera you're using, but how you use it. And we've already talked about most of the aspects of how to use your camera without ever picking up the camera, because the lighting and the scene and the styling matter a lot more. So at the end of the day, better cameras will offer you more control, but they will not take better pictures automatically. And this is a mistake that I see a lot of people making. They think that, okay, my pictures aren't very good, so I'll go buy a better camera so my pictures get better. But if you can't already take good pictures with your camera, you need to improve your skills at photography before you buy a more expensive camera. I mean, the more expensive cameras only get harder to use. They have more options and more features and more stuff to get in your way. So if you aren't already taking good pictures, then you should probably stick with the camera you have until you get to the point where you say, "Oh, these pictures look good, but I just wish I had more control." And that's what happened to me. I actually used a $100 point-and-shoot camera for the first 6 months of my blog. I took a lot of great pictures with this camera, and then eventually I was like, I really wish I could control the aperture better, and I need a better depth of field, and I need more light in the sensor, and I need more control over the ISO. And I started getting to those technical questions and said, okay, it's time to upgrade to a DSLR camera. But until you get to that point, it really doesn't matter so much which camera you use. And the three cameras we're talking about are a mobile camera, and I call it an iPhone camera. If you're one of those poor souls who's using an Android or, God forbid, a Windows phone, you can replace iPhone with whatever your favorite mobile device is, but I definitely prefer the iPhone and the iPhone's camera. And that's the first category. The second category is a point-and-shoot camera. These usually range from maybe $100 to $300 or $400 on the higher end. They don't offer interchangeable lenses, they don't offer too much control, but they do offer a little more control and have a little better sensors than the iPhone cameras. But on the upper end of the scale, from the $600 to $10,000 range, are the DSLR cameras. And these are what professionals use. They give you the most control. You can change the lenses and do a lot more with these cameras. So let's do a quick comparison, just in a nutshell, to compare what the differences are between these cameras in a quick chart. Now, first on the price level, mobile cameras are very cheap. You probably already have one in your pocket. They're not necessarily cheap because the phones cost several $100s, but they pretty much come along with the value of the phone, so we'll call them cheap. Point-and-shoot cameras, as I mentioned, are maybe $100 to $400 on the upper end. They're fairly affordable. DSLRs start at about $600 and go up to crazy amounts of money for really high quality cameras, and then the lenses themselves can be upwards of $1,000 if you want a different lens. And that's the second issue is on a mobile phone, the lens is obviously fixed inside the phone and there's nothing you can do about that. On a point and shoot camera, you have a fixed lens that has some zoom elements usually, but there's not much you can do with it. But on the DSLR, you can change the lenses, which is a very valuable asset to have. You can get a longer telephoto lens like you would see at sporting events. You can get shallower lenses that help you control depth of field better. So you get a lot more control with a DSLR interchangeable lens. And that's really the big difference, is that on a mobile phone, you have no control over the ISO and the other technical aspects. On a point-and-shoot camera, you have a little bit of control. Sometimes they let you change certain aspects, but on the DSLR, you can control each element of the camera to get exactly the type of shot that you want with the perfect balance of settings. But along with that control means that DSLRs are a lot more complex. Mobile phones are immediate. You just open the app and take a picture, and there's really nothing else you can do. On a point-and-shoot camera, it's basically the same process. That's why they're called point-and-shoot cameras. You take it out of your pocket, you point it at something, and you take a picture. And that's what they're designed for. But a DSLR is very complex. So again, that gives you more control, but it also requires more skill and time and effort to take better quality pictures. So finally, the aspect you're probably most wondering about is the photo quality. And that's something I can't really answer. You can find some stunning pictures taken on an iPhone, and I've taken some pretty terrible pictures on my DSLR. And the point is that it's much more about your skills and the item you're taking a picture of than it is about the quality of your camera. At this point, let's look at a few technical details. This is basically the only section of the course that gets a little bit technical, because again, our goal with this course is to help you take good pictures of food, not master all of the dials on your camera and talk about lenses and apertures and shutter speeds. We're going to introduce these concepts, but if you really want to go deeper, there's other courses on Udemy, there's plenty of books that'll talk about how to use DSLRs and the more technical aspects. And if you don't care about this at all and you just want to use your iPhone and let it do everything automatically, it'll do that for you and you can gloss over this section and you won't really be missing too much if it's not your goal to develop the more technical skills of photography. So we're going to talk about the three elements that make up the overall exposure and composition of your pictures. Every camera has these elements. Your iPhone has them, a point-and-shoot camera has them, but on a DSLR you can actually control them. So they're present on the other cameras, they're just happening automatically behind the scenes, and on the DSLR you can control them yourself. The first is the aperture, and if you look at this picture on the right side, which I got from Wikipedia, it's a perfect example of aperture. Aperture is the opening that allows more or less light to reach the lens. So on the top one, you have a very wide aperture, and on the bottom picture you have a very narrow aperture. And as you might imagine, this brightens and darkens the image. So if you have a wide aperture, you're going to get more light and a brighter picture. If you have a very narrow aperture, you're going to get less light and a darker picture. Aperture also affects the depth of field, which we'll talk about in the next slide, and that determines how much of the image is in focus versus how much is blurry. If you have a very wide aperture, you're going to have a very shallow depth of field, which means that your picture is going to be brighter, but only a very small piece of it is going to be in focus, and the things in front of that and behind of that are going to be blurry. Now these are measured in something called f-stop numbers, and an f-stop number, you can think of it like a fraction. So the f is like a 1 over 16 or 1 over 1.8. So the smaller the number, like f16, is going to be a very small opening, but a larger number, like f1.8, is going to be like the top image where you have a very wide opening, letting in a lot of light. Now let's look at what happens when we change our aperture. Both of these were taken on a 55mm lens with a 1600 ISO, which is fairly high, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the first one has an aperture of 5.6. Now remember, this means that the opening is wider in my camera. The second one has an aperture of 11. So notice what two things changed from the first picture to the second. Obviously the second one is darker, because there's a smaller opening and less light is getting in. But notice the background and the bananas. That is the depth of field. Whereas with this larger aperture on the first picture, you can see that only the cranberries are in focus, and as we start to get to the background, things get much more blurry. But on the second picture, there's a wider depth of field, which means that the cranberries and the bananas are in focus, and if we went even higher on the aperture with a smaller opening, it would look even more consistent in terms of the focus on the cranberries and the bananas. So let's say you really want those bananas and the cranberries to be in focus, but you don't have enough light. What do? Because your pictures are going to get darker if you have the smaller aperture. So this is where the other two elements come in. First is shutter speed. The shutter opens to allow the sensor in your camera to be exposed to light. And on this first picture, it was open for only 1/60th of a second, which is extremely fast. But on the second picture, it was open for half a second. So the longer this window, or the shutter, is open, the more light reaches your sensor. And this number is measured in seconds or fractions of a second. So on the first one you can see it's 1/60th of a second, and on the second one you can see it's half a second, or it could be 2 or 3 seconds, which is very slow and open for a very long time. So if you combine this with the aperture, notice how we could get a much better picture of those bananas by leaving our shutter open for longer with the smaller aperture. So that's how these elements can work in balance. You can adjust one to get the kind of picture you want, and another one to get the kind of exposure you want, and they all go together. Now the third aspect is the ISO. This is an acronym that describes your camera's sensitivity to light. Now, a higher ISO number means better pictures, but it's also going to introduce speckled noise into your picture. You know those little dots that look like speckly static? Those are noise. And the higher your ISO number, the more noise you're going to get. So this picture was taken at a very low ISO, and it's very dark. So we can magically make this picture look better. All the other settings are the same, but I bumped up the ISO. And in this picture on the slideshow, which is fairly small, it looks wonderful. You say, hey, why not do that every time? The problem is higher ISOs, which you may be able to see here, introduce a lot of noise into your picture, which you definitely don't want, and it's very noticeable, especially if you're going to be printing your pictures or displaying them in high resolutions. So ISO numbers go from 100, which is the lowest and the darkest, to like 12,000 or even higher on some cameras. But you definitely want to keep it as low as possible. Ideally, you'll find more light. Open another window or use a reflector to boost the light in the picture, not the ISO. Because the lower the ISO, the crisper and cleaner your image is going to be. Now these are basically the three elements, the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, that control what your picture ultimately looks like. Now in your iPhone, this is all happening automatically behind the scenes. And if you don't really care about it, don't want to worry about it, your iPhone will do that automatically. You can use that camera, you can use a point-and-shoot camera, but if you want more control over these aspects to take different kinds of pictures, then you'll need a DSLR camera. So given all this technical information, what should you do? How should you decide which camera to use for food photography? And as we've discussed, iPhones and point-and-shoot cameras give you basically no control. A DSLR will give you full control. And which one is better is totally up to you. Obviously, budget considerations come into mind. An entry-level DSLR with a lens is probably going to be $600 to $800, whereas a point-and-shoot will be $100, whereas your phone is probably already in your pocket right now. So that's one aspect to consider, is what kind of budget you have, and as well as how far you want to take this. If you really want to get serious and you really want to take good pictures and you want to make it a hobby or even a business with a food blog or something else, then you might want to get a DSLR, make the investment, take the time to learn how to use its functions, and you'll get a lot more out of your pictures. But again, it goes back to the fact that the person behind the camera is a lot more important than the camera itself. So learning how to take good pictures on whatever camera you have right now is probably the best place to start. In the final section of this lesson, we're going to play a little game. I'm going to show you 4 or 5 different pictures that I've taken, and you have to guess which camera they were taken on. So here's the first one. These are the molasses peanut butter cookies. We've seen these several times. Which camera do you think that I used to take this picture? The iPhone, the point and shoot, or the DSLR? This one was taken on a DSLR, and there's a few reasons why you may notice this. First is the shallow depth of field. Notice how the cookies are in focus, but the peanut in front of the cookies and the peanut behind the cookies, as well as the burlap and the glass of milk and everything else, is out of focus. So you can see the front of the cookies, and you can see the one peanut off of the burlap is aligned with the cookies on the same plane. So both of those are in focus, and everything else is out of focus. That is an effect you can only achieve on a DSLR. If this was taken on an iPhone or a point-and-shoot camera, the whole scene would pretty much be in focus, and there would be very little blurred front and back. Also, it's very bright, and there's a sense of crispness in this picture that would be hard to achieve on another type of camera. Here's another one. This is a picture of walnuts that we've discussed several times in this course. Which camera do you think I used to take this picture, and why? This one was actually taken on my iPhone. And as you can see, the picture looks fairly good. It has good lighting, the colors are nice, there's a little bit of distortion. It seems like the ramekin looks a little taller than it should be, and that can happen with cheaper lenses, and certainly an iPhone has a much cheaper lens than a DSLR. So it's not perfect, and I would rarely use my iPhone to take professional quality pictures of food, but in this case I wanted to give an example of how an iPhone can take a fairly decent picture. It's well lit, it's well composed, and it looks alright. Here's another one. These are blue crystal cupcakes that I made in honor of the Breaking Bad finale with blue rock candy on top. For this one, I actually used a point-and-shoot camera. Now, how would you know that? You probably wouldn't. Notice how there is a little bit of blur in the background. The picture looks fairly decent. If it was higher resolution, you would see that there's a lot more noise than there would be on a DSLR because the point-and-shoot camera has a smaller sensor that doesn't gather as much light, which means, again, the ISO needs to be bumped up to compensate for the brightness in the picture. So you can't really tell here, but it does have more noise than I would appreciate if I was using a DSLR. What about this one? This one should be fairly easy. All we have to do, again, is look at the depth of field. Everything in the picture is blurred except for what's right here in front of us, the chopsticks and the piece of dessert sushi. So the DSLR was used for this shot. It's got great brightness. The ISO is fairly low, so there's low noise and it's very crisp, and it has a shallow depth of field that gives me exactly what I was looking for, so you can see everything in the background but really highlight what's in the foreground. And that's an effect you can only achieve on a DSLR. And finally, let's do one more. This is a really great picture that was taken on a point-and-shoot camera. So notice there's plenty of light, and this is the type of situation where a point-and-shoot camera really shines, because the scene is well composed and well lit, and the depth of field issue doesn't come into play too much because it's an overhead shot, and we want everything to be in focus. So if you have to use a point-and-shoot camera and you want to get more professional quality pictures, using overhead shots is a great technique because everything is in focus and you don't have to worry so much about whether the foreground or the background is blurred. In your homework for this lesson, I'd like you to explore those 3 technical settings that we talked about. Surely by now you've taken several food photography pictures, and I'm sure you have plenty of other pictures that you've taken with whatever camera you're using. And in iPhoto or Lightroom, you can get a readout of what settings were used to take each picture. That data is saved onto the picture, and it'll show you what those settings were, what the aperture was, what the shutter speed was, and it'll give you a lot of information about your picture. So in this next slide, we'll have a little appendix, and I'll show you where you can find that information in iPhoto and Lightroom. And it would be good to take a few minutes to look at what these numbers are for your specific photos and how they differ from each other now that you have a better grasp of what they mean exactly. And if you do have a DSLR or a higher-end point-and-shoot camera where you can control some of these settings, play around with them. Take a little while to adjust one setting at a time and take a few different pictures. Keep a low ISO and take some dark pictures, and then bump up the ISO and see how that affects the quality, the brightness in your pictures. Or change different aspects and see if you can get comfortable with adjusting the different settings to get different types of pictures. And as I mentioned, I'd like to show you really quickly how in iPhoto you can see all of this information we talked about. iPhoto is on the top, and the same information for Lightroom is in the bottom screenshot. So if you click on the Info tab in iPhoto, you can see all this information for the picture. So notice how the ISO for whatever picture this was 160, which is very low. The f-stop number, which is the aperture, was 2.4, and the shutter speed was 1/20th of a second. And the same information for Lightroom is on the bottom. You can see the ISO was 1250, which is fairly high, 5.0 aperture, and 1/50th of a second. So those numbers don't mean anything by themselves, but when you look at a picture in comparison and then maybe a different picture to see how the numbers changed, it can be very enlightening and show you a little more about how these numbers work together to control exposure.